on the other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
No, that can't be possible, no! It's all G1!
Always has been, mate. Always has been.
What are you doing?
Ah, shit. I think I loaded this up with blanks by
Oh, for
mistake.
fuck's sake, thanks to
Look,
your
man, your
English,
voice,
this
you
whole
can easily
sketch
just
is
teleport us
ruined.
back to
Have
us,
you
so I can
any
replace
idea how
these, and we can come
expensive
back and
these
refilm the whole
festers
thing.
were?
It's not
These
that
are
hard,
off
really.
wish,
I'm
and
the
they
one who has
still
to do the
cost
hard
several
part, doing all
$1,000s,
this
you
editing.
bastard.
If you want to sit down
Jesus
for 8 hours
Christ,
straight
what's wrong
working on
with
one of
the
these videos,
intro,
then
you
you can decide whether
idiots?
this shit...
Whether a line is successful or not isn't usually determined by the best of what's on offer, or even the worst, but rather what is in between. Every line has its bread and butter, and that is what shapes everyone's perceptions. For example, categorically, Combiner Wars had a bunch of great molds, but when all of them had a similar transformation, people ended up perceiving the line as nothing but retools. Not very analytical, because yes, the line did include retools, but not many of them, but it is understandable given how bread and butter shapes people's perceptions. For a more recent example, within the fandom, Earthrise generated two polar opposite views. For those who like to keep one foot firmly in 80s nostalgia, the line was probably one of the best things that Transformers has done in the past decade. However, for those like myself who prefer a more tactile experience with their Transformers and prefer higher levels of engineering, most of the line seemed boring. Most of it, mind you. There were still some highlights, but we're not talking about those highlights here. With that said, why is Kingdom doing exceptionally well? The base argument is pretty simple. It's got amazing figures like Cyclonus, Rat Trap, and Warpath. However, that is the top level. What about everything in between? What about what is supposed to be considered mundane? To answer that, greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to War for Cybertron Kingdom WFC-K18 Dinobot. When Kingdom first started out, there were many concerns with how the beast modes would be handled. You can't just ham-fist car-based engineering into a streamlined animal form. Things need to be different. Fortunately, as we've seen with Rat Trap, the designers didn't just work around this, they excelled in this department. Even as Wave 1 continued, almost every single release showed the engineers weren't f***ing around this time. This leads us to Dinobot, who in my opinion fills the role as baseline pretty damn perfectly. To me, this is the standard by which all bestial figures in the line should be compared to. Of course, the Dinobot named Dinobot, for whatever reason, transforms into a kaiju-ified Velociraptor, because if this thing was actually in scale, he'd basically be vertebrate-sized. On the whole, this thing is actually quite brilliant. There are things to scrutinize when you get down to the nitty-gritty, but on the whole, this is a pretty damn awesome beast mode. Of course, three factors have been prioritized: paintwork, sculpting, and proportions. The three of these points essentially take the CGI model and pump it through a realism filter, and in this case, along with the rest of Kingdom, it really works. The first thing you're probably going to notice is the truly exceptional sculpt work. I mean, we've had beast formers in the past that have done similar things, but mate, this is on another level. It's also crisp and calculated, which is a lovely deviation from the low-poly CGI models from the show. If anything, it's very similar to how classic Chug figures interpreted their designs, not going for one-to-one accuracy, but instead internalizing the design as if it was a thing in real life. No, not like that, you get what I mean. The same idea easily applies to the paintwork, which slightly emulates the screen stylings, but goes for a more subdued aesthetic. The grey spikes are far more subtle, and as such, they help break up the brown without being too in your face. The best application would easily have to be the head, with incredible piercing eyes that contain actual pupils this time. This has been something that many Kingdom figures have suffered from. The eyes often seem dead. It begs belief why they did two versions of Cheetor, yet couldn't be bothered to fix it on either one. Not a problem here though, this head is super well painted and super expressive. They even painted the tongue on the inside, now that's dedication. And yes, unfortunately due to the engineering, they had to ditch the front teeth, an issue shared with Studio Series 86 Grimlock for far less understandable reasons, but I don't tend to notice it on the design, especially since all the remaining teeth are painted in the same savage bone white as the eyes. And on top of that, the sculpting captures his personality exceptionally well. Matter of fact, as of late, several freelance designers on Twitter have come forth and have been explaining their processes behind the sculpting, process. Through this, we can logically assume that Hasbro's been hiring more freelancers specifically for Kingdom, especially those well-versed in more biological-based figure design. And holy shit has it paid off. Combine that with the top-tier War for Cybertron engineering, and you get a truly magnificent package. Honestly, there's very little to actually complain about. Yes, the gibble on the other side can be a bit cumbersome. He is not like Rat Trap or Megatron, where they barely look like they transform. However, in this instance, I think a lot more leeway than usual is necessary. Aside from the obvious price, the proportions also act as a pretty good excuse for this. He is very well spread out, and many people even consider him better than the overly wide masterpiece rendition. Not me specifically, since I've never handled that figure and have no point of reference, but apparently it's a common enough assessment. Some might also complain about the robot bits on the backs of the legs, but as far as kibble handling goes, this is a really smart way to do it. Plus, wait till you see how it works during the transformation. Shit's insane. People have also complained about the articulation, and yes, in this mode it's pretty limited. That being said, newsflash, it's a $50 Voyager. Budgets are a thing, as are beast modes, and since they've already crammed so much into this robot mode, I can't imagine a world where they could have done this and kept the budget as it is, and kept everything else intact. It's fine, it's certainly a step above Rat Trap and Black Arachnia anyway, although these are common criticisms out there on the interwebs. I don't particularly consider them issues per se. They are unfortunate byproducts of the production process, but none of them get in the way of the overall experience. There are two main things I do take issue with though, and given the budget, I still think they could have succeeded in refining them properly. First up, what the f*** are these hands? No, seriously. Have you ever seen a raptor claw in your life? You could even do one of those fake ones like in Jurassic Park. Forget accuracy for a second. On their own, these are just awful. I don't often go out and buy upgrade kits, but in this instance, I consider the practice mandatory. I don't want to see Dinobot modeling for a jewelry company.
Clever girl.
I want to see him slashing at his enemies, and he just can't do that with these hands. It's weird because these don't really tab in anywhere into the robot mode. They're meant to, but the peg doesn't really work, and even then it doesn't need to, given how everything folds together. I don't think it was a budgetary thing either. The parts count wouldn't have been raised at all. Really big shame if you ask me. So, Non-F Shockwaves Lab and whoever that company is that keeps stealing independent 3D printers' work, get to work on some replacements. We need them. The second issue I have can be seen at the back. Yes, it's a removable weapon. It's a thing. Most Kingdom beasts do that. To me, that's fine. What's not fine though is the purple plastic protruding from the back. I get that this thing has to open up and become a spinny thingy, but if I'm being honest, it looks like
Get your hand off my
yeah, this thing looks like a canine. Thing is, this issue is conceptual. The way they've designed this means that there's virtually no way around it. The plastic needs to be strong enough to open up and not break, so they can't cover it up lest they ruin the proportions or cut into the already pushed budget. Plus, you can't just paint over it, as that would make the sword look trash. I reckon going for the silver that he had in the original show might have lessened the impact, but ultimately there's no getting around this shit save for going back to the drawing board and going for a completely different weapon. That's something I would have liked, but given the emphasis on screen accuracy, I can see why they didn't. People like me who care more about the overall aesthetic than the adherence to the source material are in the minority, and as such they went to please the most amount of people. This is the result of that, and ultimately it's a somewhat annoying flaw. Still, that's two gripes with a pretty damn awesome mode. In this instance, the good easily outweighs the bad. I don't think he's the absolute most amazing beast of the line, as Rat Trap and Air Razor both exist, the latter of which I would have reviewed if I hadn't only gotten her a few days ago at the time of writing the script, but he is very well done. And again, this is the baseline for beast modes. This is the average level of quality most people expect from the line. When people compare Earthrise to Kingdom, this is one of the reasons people find there to be no contest. Of course, the same is true for both the transformation and the robot mode, which ain't your traditional legs down, arms out, flip me do, so after a quick size comparison to show he's pretty average for a Voyager, let's jump right in and get maximizing. Kingdom Dinobot's transformation is loosely based on the original Beast Wars toy, but very loosely. It uses a lot of War for Cybertron wizardry to get everything where it needs to go. But in general, the general layout is the same. First thing you want to do is remove the tail. Yes, the tail removes as I've discussed, but it's weapon parts forming, so honestly it's fine. It's not as bad as some other examples that I won't mention, because everyone hates it when I mention it. First thing you want to do is fold the dino head around completely so that it's facing fully down, and might as well move the legs up too. That should give you access to the feet and the legs, which should unclip from everything there. It's also tabbed into that section there. And now you've got this whole wibbly back section. What you want to do here is untab this and open up the head. Come around to the waist and rotate it around 180 degrees. Rotate the legs into place. Collapse the panels in on themselves. Fold up the feet and they should lock into place. And fold out the heel spurs, which are also locked into place. They should just pop out eventually. Nice, chunky legs. Make sure this hinge goes all the way forward and the robot head rotates like that, and the whole thing should peg together here. You've got sort of a slot there and a peg there, and the whole thing just kind of sits together. The slot isn't that sturdy, but it'll become sturdier later on. Take this double section here, and it pegs into the backpack using 2 slots on either side. You'll notice it just kind of sits in there like so. Now this is the really cool part. You'll notice that there's a hinge there, but you don't want to use that one. You want to use the second hinge there in the shoulder. And from there, you then rotate this panel out from the thigh, and it sits against the robot mode like that. You can see how they managed to form the toon-accurate chest whilst still using the raptor face. That is incredible, and then you can just bring the arms around like normal. I am a little bit worried about the longevity of it though, because it is at present relying on friction as opposed to the tabs. There are tabs that are supposed to lock into the snout, but they really don't. It just relies on friction, the friction of these joints. And these joints are very tight, but I don't know if they're going to hold forever. But for now, it works really well. Now, I don't know how these official arms are supposed to go. What I usually do is just keep them locked up like that, and they just sit there. They don't lock in anywhere. I guess locked up is not a good use of terminology there. There's a tab here, but if you try to tab in the dino arm, it doesn't really work, and then it just kind of sits there and doesn't lock up properly due to the lack of clearance. And you can't rotate the arm around because then it just gets stopped by that. The dino arms are pretty poorly designed, and if they're that poorly designed and just rely on friction, they could have easily used the proper claws, which would have made the dino mode look a lot better, but as it is, I guess it's fine. Regardless of whatever nitpicks I have with it, it's still a remarkably satisfying transformation. Everything has a start and end point, and it's very fun to go through. Sure, might not do anything particularly new or interesting like Cyclonus, Megatron, or Air Razor, but in general, it's fun, and that's all that matters. It's definitely memorable, it definitely gets the job done, it's definitely something I'd do again, happily, so kudos in my book. The main difference between Earthrise and Kingdom is the emphasis put on specific modes. Earthrise often put more effort into the vehicle modes, which often led to some rather wonky proportions and weird paint. Kingdom, on the other hand, goes for a balance between the two. It's pretty much a necessity thanks to the issues with designing bestial transforming robots, otherwise one mode would be essentially dog shit, kind of like many of the Beast Wars 2 figures. Yes, I went there. As such, in robot mode, Dinobot is pretty good. He's kind of in the same vein as Cyclonus, where the Beast mode and the transformation are so good that by default, the robot mode is the weakest element, despite being pretty awesome in its own right. That being said, it's nowhere near on the same level as Cyclonus, or even the likes of Air Razor. There are issues that stem from the complicated transformation, but first, the good. The head sculpt is It's a little large for my taste, which is courtesy of the screen model it derives from, but my word, the mechanical detail is phenomenal. People have actually hypothesized the idea that it uses the same CAD model as the masterpiece, and to be honest, that's entirely possible. That being said, even if that is the case, they've gone in and added a lot more mechanical detail, which works really well for the whole aesthetic. The paintwork is fantastic too. Matter of fact, the head is the most painted element of the whole robot mode, since most of the grey spikes get covered up by the transformation. That's not to say the colors are bad in any way though. The bronze plastic they chose is amazing, and it perfectly complements the dino skin. It's really surprising that it doesn't look cheap in any way. It's often really difficult to get metallic plastics to work right out of the mold, especially when GPS is a thing. Just take a look at certain Gunpla. Hell, take a look at the very existence of Games Workshop Grey. Moving down to the chest, it's alright, I guess. Engineering-wise, it really does well, lack of tabs aside, but aesthetically, it looks a smidge off. Now, this makes perfect sense. The CGI model basically stretched the entire dino head over the damn thing, and at least here they've tried to make sense of it. In an age where faux parts are somewhat of a controversial topic, the designers have technically used the dinosaur head, albeit encased in thick anime thigh panels. It is very well sculpted, it is very well painted, it's just not indicative of what it's trying to do. And you know what? Who cares? I'm never one to get angry over lack of screen accuracy, and this is probably about as accurate as they could have gotten without resorting to using a fake chest, which is basically what the masterpiece did. I'm a bit confused by the inclusion of the dino schlong on his underpants. Yeah, I know that was a thing on the screen model, but, you know, you could have just ditched it.
This is Democracy Manifest.
But the rest of the robot mode is adequate. The arms are pretty alright and use the dino legs well enough. The weapon is also decent, doing the whole fold-out shtick and separating the continually oddly chosen purple sword. It's a decent set that does a good job standing above your average Transformers gun. I'm pleasantly surprised that this tiny tab manages to grasp onto the hexagonal 5mm ports, which means you get to pull off a pretty cool Mary Poppins homage, or I suppose for the more cultured of you, a Fantoka Pohatu. Sure, I could have asked for some paint on the inside of the spinning thingy, but the budget's already been spent on the face, so yeah, it's fine. Curiously enough, there are once again two major gripes I have with this figure. It's weird, this figure's tackling a lot of twos. Firstly, the lower legs are pretty patchworky. The paint doesn't loop around the whole thing, so it seems pretty inconsistent. Then you've got these gaps in the thighs that almost look like open wounds. I don't usually mind hollowness, but considering the rest of the mold is really well covered up, it just falls a little short. Doubly so when compared to the utterly gorgeous thighs. And secondly, the shoulders are a little annoying. You've got your traditional universals on the outside, but also due to the transformation, there's a secondary joint. This means that occasionally it pushes the inner joints down, which isn't terrible, but it is slightly annoying. I don't really have much to say about this one, aside from, well, it kinda had to happen due to the transformation. Again, it's fine. Outside of that, you may get some wonky, or rather wobbly QC on the waist, but it doesn't affect much. So far, I've only heard of 3 cases, but who knows, it could be more widespread. Thankfully, it doesn't affect my copy though, which is good because the rest of the articulation works about as well as the rest of the line. Whilst I'm disappointed that the dino mode didn't have ankle tilts, it makes sense that they used the budget for the wrist swivels, especially given the sword such was very much required. A figure like Inferno can get away without wrists, but this is Dinobot we're talking about. He needs that sword motion. Fortunately, unlike some previously reviewed fellows, the sculpt work actually works to accentuate the posability. Every pose is filled with character, every angle grants an extra layer of ferocity. This is why you need good sculpting and paints for a Transformer, as otherwise you can have all the articulation in the world, but it still won't work. And I suppose size-wise, he's your average Voyager. Notably, he gets quite a bit of extra height above Primal, which works well for the character dynamic. But even then, if you're not a fan of the character, there's a lot to love here. It brings me back to the same point. This is the base level of quality. Sure, you have some outliers like your Core Primes and your Ultra Magni, and maybe even your Huffers if you're feeling extra nitpicky, but for the most part, everything works to at least this standard. Therein lies the brilliance of Kingdom, its consistency. So far, there have been very few figures that have fallen below what previous lines have considered even above average, excluding re-releases because honestly, who counts those. There hasn't been a single stinker. Even Siege had Pteranodon, Soundwave, Six Gun, and Cog, plus many considered Apeface to be a trash heap. Can't say I agree, but it was a common assessment. Then you get to Earthrise, and, yeah, I've complained enough about that. Let's leave that for now. Kingdom doesn't have that, though. It doesn't have its Soundwave or its Double Dealer. When the low point of the newly released figures is still a serviceable Legends Optimus, something has to have been done right at the planning phase. There's a reason I haven't done that many negative reviews as of late. Mainline Transformers hasn't given me much to work with on that front. The only truly angry reviews I've done have been in relation to figures I've gotten last year, and going forward there's only so many of those I can tackle. And you know what? That's okay, I'm a collector, not just some snobbish author who writes up damning pieces on action figures. Business is booming for Hasbro at the moment, and I for one couldn't be happier. But as for Dinobot himself, he is a pretty good figure. I feel he's lacking that final push to get him to the 5 out of 5 level, mainly in the bells and whistles department, but he still gets so much right regardless. If you're a character-based collector who's got a lot of nostalgia for Beast Wars and especially Dinobot, you're probably going to rank this figure extremely highly. And even if you've got no connection but are still into the engineering aspect of Transformers, well, he's still very much a worthy pickup. He's not just some half-assed representation of the character just shits out to fill waves. The designers didn't just want to make him an accurate experience, they wanted to make him a fun experience, and that I give them credit for. I want to see more figures like this, where the designers take risks, where the designers put in the extra effort instead of just doing the bare minimum. And thankfully, Kingdom seems to be doing just that, in spades, mind you. And you know what? I'm really glad that Transformers is doing so well in its toy lines at the moment. Yes, I know some of the shows are a bit garbage, but as far as the action figures go, we really are living in a golden age. And sure, the negative reviews that I make, I think turn out quite well, both in execution and reception, but man, they are so tiring to make. So forgive me for being blunt, but it's nice to have a break. It's nice to actually enjoy Transformers for once. And I, for one, hope it lasts a good long while. Wait, Unicron arrives next week, doesn't he? Ah,